What would happen if I took a chance? It's always hard at first glance. I don't wanna, but I know I gotta do it. The truth is hard to swallow. I think I'll chew it.
A few years ago, I started writing a fictitious story based on my time as an educator. It is called Taught, and the story was partially inspired out of anger and frustration fueled by burnout. Okay, actually, it was more than partially inspired by anger and frustration. But Taught has also become a vehicle for me to tell what I thought at the time, and in some ways continue to think, was and is the real story of teaching. I now realize that my perspective is not everyone's perspective, but there are some pieces of Taught that resonated with many educators. This podcast is an extension of that story, and I, a former teacher, will interview other educators asking them to share how they really feel about the current state of education. Why are so many teachers burn out? Why are so many, like me, leaving the field? We likely won't solve any problems or come up with any solutions, but we can create a community of voices that maybe begin the conversation around how educators can take back teaching. I'm Melissa LaFour. Welcome to Taught, the podcast.
I like to be educated, but I'm so frustrated.
Hey everybody! Today I have professional development specialist, learning coach, mentor, educator, speaker, author, podcaster, and education reform advocate, Jackie Scully with me. Jackie has been an educator for almost 20 years and taught in public, private, charter, and international schools in 3 states in the United States and China. As of June, she resigned her position and has begun what I'm going to start calling the transition. Her new focus is to establish herself in a growing body of educators who are taking their skills to a multitude of areas to be agents of change. She will be taking her podcast, The Teacher Story, in new directions, as well as her LinkedIn group. She will be taking her podcast, The Teacher Story, in new directions, as well as her LinkedIn group, The Teacher Circle. Additionally, Jackie is pursuing pathways that will allow her to amplify the voices of teachers and education professionals, positioning them as catalysts for meaningful reform within the education landscape. But her pathway here was not an easy one, and her courageous leap into the unknown to pursue her passions was fueled by, you guessed it, burnout. Jackie, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you, Melissa, for that amazing introduction. I just don't know what to say. I just feel like I'm so happy to be in the space with you and share a little bit about my background and my story and where I'm at currently in this transition.
I think it's going to be really motivational for our listeners too. So tell us a little bit about how you got into education and what that career has been like for you.
So when I was a little girl, I always would talk to my dad about history and geography. We had a National Geographic library. So I was kind of like a history buff nerd when I was like 5 years old. So when I was thinking about professions, I knew I wanted to work with kids. So I originally went into elementary education, but then I'm like, how am I going to talk about all this cool stuff about history and culture and all this, stuff my dad talked about with me? So I then moved into secondary education, social sciences, and I fell in love. As soon as I was student taught, I taught American history with 8th graders. I was like, this is where I'm supposed to be. And because I had this adventurous spirit and I didn't go to school too far away from where I grew up, and they were recruiting from Hawaii, I was like, sign me up. I will go to Hawaii and be a teacher. So at 20, going on 23 years old, I was only like 22 when I got the job. I went to Hawaii, packed a couple suitcases, and then spent 5 years teaching there, only really to, come back to Pennsylvania where I grew up because of the recession. So I thought I was going to, live in Hawaii forever. Of course, I was like, who cares about being poor? The teaching salary is not that much different than where I was living in Pennsylvania, and it's Hawaii. But, it was a great experience because it was the first time I really felt like I was challenging myself to get outside of my comfort zone, and the students were challenging me to get to know them and their culture. They were from all different areas of the Pacific, and I felt very out of place. My first year was quite challenging, but it stayed with me the rest of my career. I think that's what also like allowed me to stay in education so long because I had that unique experience early on. And I've been in it almost 19 years. And now in 2024, leaving the classroom after that amount of time. And I've taught in public, private, all over, but I'm really ready for this next stage.
It's very exciting. And I like that you brought up the fact that I think that I also started teaching in an area that was very similar to where I grew up. And then I had the opportunity to move to Seattle, and I ended up can be a pretty diverse city depending on where you're at. But additionally, I moved to a neighborhood that was extremely diverse. And it's always good to know that we can grow as adults, and have our ideas expanded, and to be part of that with a group of students, I think is one of the most special experiences a teacher can have. So I'm really glad you brought that up.
Yeah. And it's funny you brought up Seattle too, because a lot of my students that then went on to high school, because I taught middle school there, a lot of them end up going to Washington to go to college. So there's a lot of Hawaiian students and also just Pacific Island students who end up going to the Pacific Northwest for school. Yeah.
So you had your teaching career, and at some point I'm going to assume, began to experience some chronic stress, and perhaps that led you to the burnout zone. Uh, would you tell us a little bit about what that looked like for you?
Yeah, my first big burnout was actually when I moved back from Hawaii to Pennsylvania in a job search in a pandemic in the recession. And I was on a conveyor belt. And that's when I pivoted from public to private because I was like, you know what? I have a lot of skills, experience. I did something really unique. And in my home state, in school districts that I grew up around, and even a school district I went to, it's like it didn't mean anything. And I was getting frustrated. So that was my first burnout, just the burnout of the job search and the rat race when you're in a economic situation like that. Then I would say the next big one was the pandemic. Of course, there's different times of burnout with like workload and all of that. I taught AP for a really long time, so just grading burnout. But the pandemic was the time where I felt there was very little appreciation for everything we were doing, like pivoting to a whole virtual program in like 3 days
Yeah.
at my last school and having to be called upon to do all this extra work. And there was just this negative vibe. There wasn't even like trying to make it like we're coming together, community, positive. It felt like people gave up on us. It just felt like, I don't know, we were getting more on our plate, less affirmation, more judgment. And I had a breaking point in 2021. So actually, the spring 2020, it was hard. It was a lot, but we were remote, we were home. There's actually some peace and balance in that time, like work-life balance. And then going back and doing hybrid, that nearly broke me and nearly broke a lot of teachers and a lot of teachers that I've had on my podcast, The Teacher Story, as well as like hybrid or even being virtual that whole year. Um, you just got burnt out from like, is this ever going to end? And then when we're coming back online in 2021, 2022, it felt like, okay, things are going to get better. And it just wasn't. And so it felt like you were on a runaway train and the wheels were falling off and you just didn't know where it was going. And then it just started to get political with curriculum. I'm a history teacher. So the whole like debate about CRT in the
Mhm.
curriculum and no one even knew what that was. And you had school board fights. This wasn't happening at my school, but you had it happening in many parts of the country in America. And And I remember laying in bed. It was like the winter 2021 and in 2022. And I just felt numb. I was just like, I wasn't fully like depressed in the way of like, oh my God, I just wanted it all to stop. Like, I just was like numb. I just wasn't passionate about anything. I wasn't passionate about hobbies. Um, I was not a good family member anymore. I don't even know. I always say like my husband's an angel. I don't know how he stayed with me through all that. And then that's when in 2022, I was like, okay, I need to start a podcast and I need to start interviewing teachers. We need to share our voices because enough is enough. And that's just kind of how I felt. And then this past year, I just made the final decision of um, this lifestyle doesn't work for me anymore. And I've been now around a lot of people who are doing school a lot differently and who have different like work-life balance in their lives. And I'm just like, I can't get more and more dumped on my plate every year. And the salary's not really going up. There's still not a lot of affirmation and respect. So, I can't keep doing this. So I was like, it's either now or I'm going to regret it. And I'm 42. I just turned 42. So I'm like halfway through, a little bit more halfway through in my career. So I took that leap of faith. I resigned without a job, thinking I was going to get something. And then that didn't work out, but it made me do a 180 and think about what I really, really am passionate about and what I want to do in the education industry. Because I do want to still be in it and make an impact in some way.
Yeah, so you touched on a bunch of things there. I'm going to go back just a minute. My computer screen is seeing the sun and going in and out on me. Um, so one of the things you mentioned was during the pandemic, how stressful that was for teachers because we literally had to recreate our jobs. We had to say, okay, this thing that you've done for however many years you've done it, now you need to create the online version, go. And you need to have it ready by Monday, right? And then we were criticized for how we were doing it. But at the very beginning of all of that, I remember, and the same thing happened in the hospitals with first responders and nurses and doctors. It was, oh, our teachers really stepped up to the plate. They're so wonderful. And for this little bitty brief moment, it was like, they're noticing what we're doing, right? And then, as you mentioned, it turned political and we were villainized along with the first responders and the nurses and the doctors and everybody that
Mm.
had to show up. I mean, a lot of us didn't have the luxury, not that it was a luxury if you were home and you lost your job. I don't want to make it sound
Mm.
that way, but we really had to be on during the pandemic, and still showing up as best we could. So it was very
Mhm.
challenging. But I also want to say to you, when I moved to Seattle, I moved without a job too. And I had this idea. That would have been 2015, I think I left. I left Kansas and I moved to Washington. And I had this idea that Seattle is a huge area. Somebody's going to need a teacher, right? And after, probably my, I don't know, 20th application, and I hadn't had any interviews, then I finally started getting interviews and I wasn't getting a second interview or called. Um, I got a job. And if you're a teacher, you'll understand the first week of August. And it
Yeah.
was just like, oh my gosh. I thought we had made the biggest mistake of our lives. I
Mm.
mean, it was so somehow we educators do manage to find our way, even in
Yeah.
those moments where it's like, okay, well, that didn't work out. I ended up not getting, I'm an English language arts teacher. I had always taught middle school English language arts, and I ended up getting a job in a classroom. I was a classroom teacher in an
Yeah.
elementary setting. So it was quite a bit different, but I was very thankful to have the paycheck. So,
Yeah. And a lot of people don't know the how rigorous it is to get like a decent teaching. Like you can get a teaching job in a lot of places, but one where it's a good school district. It's managed well. There's good leadership. There's a decent salary because that is very different, even city to city, town to
Yes, it
town.
is.
Good benefits, right? Um, they're competitive. I mean, even out of a recession, they are very, very competitive. And it it can be deflating when you have so much experience and unique ways that maybe you've taught or different places, and then you just like don't get seen at all. Like even not just to get an interview. I have been there.
And I think that different schools and different districts, different states, different cities, sometimes the values are based on the culture that's there, and those can vary. So something that you have done has been part of your teaching canon and is near and dear to you sometimes isn't respected in a
Yeah.
different environment. So, and that is challenging also.
Hmm.
So it sounds like, burnout brought you to this place here, and you've already mentioned your podcast a couple of times. So you actually began that before you resigned your teaching career. Kudos to you, because I joke, but it's not a joke. This is like my full-time job now that I pay for. I actually
Yes.
spend money on my podcast. So it's a very expensive hobby and very time
Yeah.
consuming. But probably like me, and it sounds like you feel pretty passionate about what you're doing. Tell us about your podcast.
Yeah, I was starting to think I was going to transition out of the classroom in that year I started the podcast in 22. And it just wasn't working out. I felt like, maybe it's good where I'm at, maybe just see where it goes. I also had this trip I wanted to plan at my school because one really great program we had is intensive learning. And I had on the back burner this trip to lead to Germany, a World War II trip. And I had that idea in 2019. And then the pandemic in 2020 didn't happen. And then it just was on the back burner. So I was like, you know what? It's going to happen. So I'm going to just stay with it because I have some ideas of what I want to do here. And then I started a podcast, and podcasting and teaching full time. It's near impossible. Again, my husband's an angel. I don't have children, so I will say that this became my baby. The podcast, even though I have two adorable fuzzy King Charles Cavaliers and they
Oh,
are like toddlers, but it's not like I'm taking care of young children. But it's a lot. Podcasting is a lot. Same here. Put a lot of money into it. It's not really like you're not trying maybe one day to make some kind of money from it, but it's a passion.
yeah.
And it did start off as a project. I was like, I'm just going to do this from Teacher Appreciation Week. That's when I kicked it off in May to June till the end of the school year. Okay, I'll do that for like a month and a half. And people just started coming in, and I'm like, oh man, this is a space that's needed. So
Mhm.
then it became like more of a mission of, well, I'm just going to keep doing it as long as like the guests keep coming and there's alignment. I'm just going to keep doing it. And it worked its way out like that for 2 years. And then I took a conscious kind of pause in this past June because I'm in a transition. Um, and I'm trying to be really focused. And also kind of naturally, the clients just kind of, or clients, the guests kind of just it dried up. So I took that as a sign of maybe I'm supposed to be on a pause right now and focus on this new direction I'm going in. And then I'm doing like a rebrand relaunch in January. So I definitely want to keep it up because I love it. And I want to have more guests on, even outside of the education industry, and have more expansive conversations. But I felt called to do it. And then once the people were coming through, I was like, well, I got to do it. I got to figure it out while I'm full-time teaching. I did step away from roles at my school. So I was one of those teachers, you might relate. A lot of teachers I've talked to do. I'm a recovering people pleaser. I used to do everything in the school. Like sign me up on this committee. I'll do this. Not paid, and
Mhm.
just kept doing more and more. And then I started to pull back. I was asked to be department chair and I said no. I was like, I'd rather do this. Like if I'm going to do anything else outside the classroom teaching, besides some of the other things like the trip that I planned, I'm going to do my podcast.
Yeah.
And I've made great friends. I've made this like beautiful community of people. Um, it's been life changing. So I believe podcasting is like the new way of actually getting to know real people and getting the truth out there and getting really authentic narratives, because we know the news and the other type of media don't do that.
Yeah, and I think I've said this before, but I think there's a bit of a legacy of secrecy within the education world where we put on
Mm,
this face that is everything is fine. You don't talk about what really happens until you go out to have margaritas with everybody that one Friday, and then we're all sitting there talking about all the stuff that we're really thinking and feeling. And I don't know about you, but I've lost count of the number of guests I've had on that when we're done, they say, that was therapeutic. And it's not,
mm.
obviously, I'm not a therapist and they're just talking, but just like you said, having the space to say your truth is huge. And I don't think educators have had that for a really long time.
Yeah. Yeah. It can be hard to have a voice in a school. Everyone's always very scared of like, is it going to cause, friction? Am I going to get in trouble? Like there's still this feeling of a teacher feeling like a student, like I don't want to get in trouble. And
Yeah.
like that's problematic, right? We really need to change that culture. So I think these spaces, these education podcasts are helping that a bit.
Yeah. I think they definitely will. So, did the teacher circle come out of the podcast?
Yeah, I did.
Tell us a
So
little
I
bit
had a
about that.
couple, yeah, thank you. I had a couple guests on that were kind of in the same position as me. They felt like there needed to be a space where we were helping teachers and not just like event space and not just a space for teachers transitioning. Because what we saw on LinkedIn especially was that it was either you had teachers who were, creating spaces. I saw this more on Facebook that were just like, we're gonna just complain about everything, or you had transitioning teachers, but there wasn't anything in between of like, well, how about for us that are still in it and we need a space that we support each other and we support what we're doing. And we really wanted to think more globally and not just maybe what was going on in America, even though, of course, like the pandemic is global. And I'm sure a lot of teachers that I've talked to as well on my podcast, very similar experiences as what we had. So we created the teacher circle as a support group and to make it positive, but also like realistic and be a place where you can share resources. You can share your passion projects you're working on. You're part of that. There's been a lot of people that share their podcasts on there, that share their curriculum. So I think it's also like a great place to like lift each other up with all the other like projects we work on outside the classroom and not necessarily make it all just about like lesson planning and grading and whatnot. So I thought that was a great space for that.
And so the teacher circle is a LinkedIn group. And I'll tell you what I like about it is that at this point in my life, I have no intention of going back into the classroom. And so there are spaces for people like me that have projects that are still pretty invested in education, but I'm invested in it as we need some reform here. And
Hmm.
we need to be, very vocal about that. And a lot of those other groups, it's either you're sharing lesson plans and crafting ideas, or you're trying to start, World War III. So, and I don't feel like
Yeah,
I
yeah,
fell into either one
yeah,
of
it's true.
those. I
Yeah.
think we can advocate for a better system and not necessarily burn the current system down.
Exactly. I've talked about that a lot. That's so true. You have to have the truth with also the hope, right? And that there's people still in it. And
Yeah.
you don't disregard, because what I saw a lot of in 22 was, I wouldn't say transitioning teachers like bashing other teachers that are staying in it, but there's just so much like there were some tones of like, we got to burn it all down to the ground. It needs to just start over. I'm like, that's not helping anyone that's that's still in it. It's only not helping the children.
And we
So
kind
we
of
need
did
another
that in the
method.
pandemic.
Yeah.
We were at
Yeah.
ground level, right? And we couldn't rebuild it. I mean, there's so
Right.
much work to be done. It was so eye-opening.
Yeah.
So now, you wrote a book. So we have podcast, we have teacher circle, then came the book, or did the book come before? What was the sequence there?
So in my brain, the first thought was book. And then my limiting belief, like ego came in saying, no, you can't do that. That's too daunting. But a podcast was doable. So I was like, I'm going to do a podcast. So it stayed in the back of my brain for about a year. And then it came back through, and I was ready after doing a lot of my own kind of inner work excavation to tell my story. And I felt like the book was for me, but I also thought if I could go there and be pretty vulnerable and truthful in my book and tell my story from being a child to entering the school system, what that was like for me as a student, because it started off pretty bumpy and it led to a lot of insecurity, and then to becoming a teacher and telling those various stories of all the places I've taught, and then kind of to this, the end is kind of my awakening of the reform and the bigger picture, and really looking at systemic change
Mhm.
in this industry. So, I felt called to do it. I was really determined. I used my summer break because we all know, again, it's very hard to do anything extra outside the full time. I was still full-time school teacher. So I wrote that book last summer. I self-published, had a pretty good launch in the fall of 23, and now it's kind of, simmered. And I think I'm going to have some resurgence of that as I get back out there in a new role. And I really want to then see myself also not in professional development only, like as a career, but as a speaker and really speaking about how we're going to shift this system. So it was hard to write a story like that and be so vulnerable. I didn't say everything that's happened in my life. I wasn't like spilling the beans about all this stuff, but was pretty vulnerable about how I felt as a student, and some of the shadow and insecurities I felt even into adulthood. And then some sensitive, times early teaching where I felt really, again, insecure, like my time in Hawaii and the lessons I had to learn. And I was like, I don't see a lot of people sharing that. I thought this could also be really good for students. Like I have some students, former students, that have purchased my book and read it, and they're like, oh, wow. Like they don't know that teacher perspective. They don't know the behind the
Yeah.
scenes. I have friends outside the education industry that learn so much about it. So really, I wanted to also be a book that could touch on people outside the role so that they
Right.
can learn something about it. And then people already knew me through my podcast, through the LinkedIn community, or through my various teaching roles. So there was a little bit of like, oh, I get to know a little bit more, intimate view on this one teacher. Um, so it was very hard. Writing a book is very difficult, but I'm so glad I did it. And I have some other book ideas in mind.
Well, hopefully we can talk the podcast can promote the book a little bit too, because I will put all of your links, the link to the teacher circle, the link to your podcast. You have two because one wasn't enough. You have two, right? And a link to your book, to your
Thank
or
you.
your Amazon link. Yeah. Because one of the hardest things about doing all of this is, well, you realize pretty quickly, um, if you're going to publish a book and you want it to like be promoted, you have to have an agent. And
Yeah.
just getting an agent is almost impossible. I mean,
Yes.
unless you know somebody, right? Unless you are, you know, I have read lots of blogs about this and even authors that are just amazing, like top of the line authors. have published papers and a variety of things at universities. Even they have a challenging time being.
Mm,
It's not the publishing part that's the hardest because you can self-publish. So that piece is
mhm.
kind of nice. It is really the promotion.
It is.
That is the challenge. And if you're promoting without an agent, even harder, which is what, again, why I kind of feel like we all need to bond together and promote each
Yeah,
other's products
exactly.
because there's a lot of good stuff out there. And I'm learning a lot about advertising and just how to keep up with
Yeah.
all of that, promoting the podcast, putting stuff
Yep.
together. I thought, it's a crazy world we live in where you can go on the internet and kind of teach yourself how to do anything,
You can. You really can. Watch
thankfully.
YouTube.
Yeah, it's incredible. So, what are the long-term goals for the projects?
I would say all of the projects and again, some new ideas that I have for the relaunch of the podcast and also some book ideas. It's all going back to I want to be a voice in education and do it in a way that there's truth there, there's conviction, but I'm trying to approach it in a loving and graceful way. I want to open up people's hearts to want to join this movement. And really, I see it as a movement. I do, maybe not by the time, maybe I'll be dead and then education will change, but this will be my mission until the day I die. But I at least want to see the dial moving in the right direction. And so I will continue with whatever else that I create to be working in that. And not just in education, but the idea of like, we need to be whole human beings. Like, how are we just healthier people? Right. So, how are we taking care of ourselves? How are we being more authentic? How are we having better connections? I think that was another thing we learned in the pandemic was we lost a lot of connection and how important that connection is and community. So just being able to speak on that too. So one thing outside of the job transition is I'm looking to apply to a TEDx and I'm hoping to get that by next year. I just gotta just keep doing it one project at a time and we'll just see where it goes. It's fun too, it's I always say life's an experiment. Just keep trying things on.
And it works. I mean,
Mm,
the just sticking with it, right?
yeah.
Because it seems like sometimes, especially when I was a classroom teacher, I thought, there's all these things that the cool kids are doing, and I'll never be a part of that. And then I was like, wow, I've got nothing but time on my hands, and I'm just going to start doing stuff. And then I'm amazed because then I end up meeting people like you, and I end up having these experiences that I never would have dreamed of having. So, I think what you're doing is inspirational for a lot of educators out there that even if they don't want to leave the classroom, they want something better than where we're at. And they also want to try on some things like writing books and, having speaking engagements and doing things like that. So, and it just occurred
Yeah.
to me as you were talking, you have a website.
Yeah.
Yeah. And all of your projects are probably on your website.
Yes, they are. Yeah.
So we can follow along and see what new stuff you come up with. I will also share your website on the
Thank
show notes.
you, because that's
Yeah.
gonna get a revamp too later this summer. I am looking to add some other things to my website, such as other services that I'd like to offer. So just kind of working on my side biz while I'm doing this other stuff, because I've come into tapping into some other gifts of mine through the other podcast that I co-host with a friend. And I really want to look at helping others tap into their own voice and truth and how to have really important conversations or make big life decisions, take their own leap of faith. I walked through the fire this year. I could do it. If I could do it, and I used to not be that kind of person that could do anything like what I've just done this last year, anyone could do it. So that's kind of going to be part of the revamp of the website. Mm.
Amazing. I have a feeling you're going to have some people reaching out to you.
I wish I knew.
Today's episode was produced and edited by me. The theme music is by Otis McDonald featuring Joni Inez.
But I'm so frustrated.
If you know someone who might enjoy these conversations, please share the podcast episodes as much and as often as you can. It's as simple as copying the link you use to access today's episode and sending it in a message or sharing it on social media. I'm a small, independent operation, and your shares broaden our audience. Perhaps you or someone you know will be inspired to talk about teacher burnout. If you would like to get your voice on my podcast, contact me via the link on my webpage, taught.buzzsprout.com. Coach, speaker, and author Rashid Ogunlaro said, "It may take many voices for people to hear the same message." Join me in being one of the many voices rising up to get the message out around educator burnout. This is Melissa LaFleur. Thank you for listening to Taught, the podcast.
I wish I knew